Okay, well, thanks for having me. I'm excited to share what I've learned. I've been a master gardener for 5 years now and have just done a lot of this. So hopefully some of the things I've learned the hard way, I can pass on to you. The first thing I'd like to go over is why should you garden? And so there's so many reasons, and I just listed some of them here. And so obviously the food that you grow at home is healthier, fresher, and tastes better. It doesn't travel from a farm to a grocery store to you. And the quicker you eat food after it's been picked, the more vitamins and mineral content it has. And we all know that freshly picked food just tastes amazing. Also, you obviously can reduce your grocery bill by growing your own food. And especially if you prefer organic produce, which we know costs a lot. There's food security. And right now we see some of the problems with food security and the supply chain. And so when you're able to grow your own food, you have more security in that area. Also, it's great for outdoor exercise. We know that that's really good for our mental health and our physical health. And one interesting fact is that for every calorie of food that you eat from the store represents 10 calories from oil. And that's so when the more local of the food you get, the less true that is. So it's great to eat local when you can. And also in our family, one reason we do this is just to teach our children how to work and that food doesn't come from a store. And that it's also a great time for us to be together as a family. So this is the kind of garden that I had growing up, and it's a traditional row garden. And basically it's just a huge square of earth that's been tilled up. And when you plant the garden, you just plant one row of all the same crop, and then you leave a space for walking in, and then you plant another row of a different crop, and then you leave another space, and that's how I did gardening growing up. And since then, I've learned a new way. And so some of the problems with traditional row gardening is that there's a lot of wasted space between the rows. And those spaces where your rows are, they fill with weeds and it can be problematic. There's wasted seeds by overplanting only to thin. Basically, you just sprinkle the seeds down the row and then later you'd come back and pull out the plants that were not necessary. And it also requires a lot of watering and weeding. We would just put a sprinkler on the whole thing. So the rows, the plants would get wet, but also the aisles you're walking through would get wet and muddy and covered with weeds. And when you grow a whole row of something, frequently that's more than you can use. If you grow a whole row of lettuce, it all gets ready at once and it's often wasted. It also takes a lot of time and effort to develop ideal soil conditions. So I know here on our farm, we have clay. And so it takes a lot of amendments and building up the soil over time to make it a decent soil for gardening. It also requires a lot of tools and equipment. So this picture here is my neighbor's row garden. And he is in the middle of getting it ready for planting. So he has to till it he tills it every fall and every spring. And right now he's in the middle of putting out some soil amendments for the year. And as you can tell, you cover the whole area with these amendments and you have to till the whole area, even the places where there will be no plants. So this is the new method that I've learned, and it's called square foot gardening. And you can see if the picture here on the left is shortly after we planted our garden. It's very early in the season. And then the picture here on the right is further along in the season. So the plants are much bigger. So I learned how to do this from this book. It's called The All New Square Foot Garden by Mel Bartholomew. And with the benefits of square foot gardening is you can grow more in less space. You'll also grow only what you'll need and use by making a plan. It significantly reduces watering and weeding requirements, and that's because you're not watering or weeding in those rows. It's much easier to create ideal soil conditions because you just add all the soil in that first year that you need. So the soil you have in your ground under it doesn't really make much of a difference. You can also put your garden in a convenient location, and it requires very few tools. You don't need a big tiller or any big equipment whatsoever. The first question you want to ask yourself is where you should put your square foot gardens when you want to build one. And you want to put them in an area that receives about 6 to 8 hours of sunlight and is clear of trees or shrubs that might interfere. You also don't want the area to be prone to puddles or excess moisture, and that can be a problem here in Wisconsin, especially in the spring when we get a lot of rain. And the closer to your home it is, the more convenient it is, and the more likely you'll be out there stopping by briefly to see how it's doing, to take care of it. And also when you need something for your dinner that night, it's just easy to run out the door and grab it real quick. So the layout for these garden boxes are, they should be no wider than 4 feet. And that's because you never want to actually step in your square foot garden. So you can reach about two feet out to take care of your garden. So you don't want it any wider than 4 feet. So you can care for your garden from each side of the bed. And then for kids, you want it even a little smaller than that because they can't reach as far as adults. So 3 feet is good for kids. And on patios, 2 feet is best because you usually can't get care for it from the opposite side. So you want a depth of anywhere from 8 to 12 inches. So where we grow potatoes, we like a little bit deeper of a bed. So we have 12 inches there, but a lot of our other beds are 8 to 10 inches. So the length of these boxes can be anywhere from 4 to 12 feet. And you don't really want it any longer than 12 feet because then it gets hard to walk all the way around it and you'll be tempted to walk through it, which you want to avoid. So the frames of the garden beds can be made from almost any material. And I've seen stone and I've seen rocks and I've seen metal square foot gardens. So they can really be made from any materials you have on hand, but untreated lumber is ideal. So if you buy the 2x8 untreated lumber, it comes in 8-foot lengths. So for each 4x8 garden bed, you'll need to buy 3 of those. So when you're fastening them together, you deck screws work the best, and you want to rotate the alternate corners to end up with a square inside. Now, if you're putting these frames over what is currently grass, you can either dig out the grass, but that's a lot of work. So a better way to do it is to cover it with cardboard first, which will kill all the grass and weeds under the bed. And so those things don't come up through your new garden soil. So the aisles you want in between each garden bed, you'll need to have aisles where you walk and work around your beds. And you want to separate each of them by 3 to 4 feet. And so we've tried a bunch of things over the years. First, we just had grass. That was what was on this garden site before we made a garden, was just grass. And even though we put the cardboard down, the cardboard works for a while, but eventually it decomposes and grass will sneak into your beds because grass is very tenacious. And I don't recommend having grass around. And the other problem with grass is you also have to weed whack around each bed, which, nobody loves to weed whack. So we also tried wood chips, and wood chips, so we put cardboard and wood chips down, and it does work good for a while, but eventually those things decompose and they start to create pretty good soil in and of themselves. So you'll find a lot of weeds will come up through that eventually, and you'll have to reapply that over and over if you want to keep it looking nice. We tried hay one year in between the beds, and we had a really bad slug problem that year, so we do not recommend using hay. What we decided to do, because we have so many gardens and they take so much work in and of themselves, we decided to purchase these black rubber mats that you can see here in this picture. And even though there was a high initial cost, it has saved us a lot of cost over the years, as we haven't had to reapply anything there, and it requires no work whatsoever for us. I've also read that you can do a similar type of thing with old billboard covers. I've never tried that for myself, but if you're interested, you could look into that and see if that works well for you. Now, when you fill these beds, it's recommended that you fill them with a mixture of 1/3 compost, 1/3 peat moss, and 1/3 coarse vermiculite. And the peat moss you can find at most hardware stores. The vermiculite is a little harder to find, but we found it at different farm stores in our area. And when you're buying compost, it's actually best to make it yourself from many ingredients, and that makes sure that it has the nutrition that it needs for your plants. But if you're not able to make it yourself, it's important to buy a quality product. A lot of products on the market are made by decomposing only one thing, and that's not, so if you do end up buying that compost, you frequently want to buy, several different bags from several different companies, so that you're not getting just the same one product that was decomposed to make it. So the vermiculite and peat moss are important in this process because it helps hold the moisture and keep the soil loose. The next step.
Abbie,
yes.
Question. We have a question in the chat that asks, so the black rubber mats are placed on the grass and then mixture for planting?
So we had already built our beds when we placed the black rubber mats down. But so what we did was we had to lift each bed up a little bit, and we put like 2 or 3 inches of the rubber mat just on the inside of the bed when we did that. Is that the answer to the question? I'll take a look at the question myself, see
Okay.
what. Okay. So we do not have the black rubber mats under the beds themselves, actually. Under the beds, we had just put the cardboard down under there. The mats do not allow water to go through. But so what we ended up doing was we kind of sliced some holes just down the middle so the water will drain out. And so we can sometimes get weeds up through those slices, but those are pretty easily taken care of. So, okay. Okay, so the next step when building your garden is a grid. And the author of this book thinks they're very important, but we find them to be optional. But if you're interested in doing it, on top of each frame, you want to place a permanent grid that divides the box into 1-foot squares. And these grids can be made from pretty much anything: wood, plastic strips, old Venetian blinds, twines, whatever you have on hand will work. We choose to just use the seating square that you can see in the picture. So as we plant our bed, we just push it down And so we can see all the square feet as we plant. And this seeding square is also very nice because it actually shows, depending on the crop you plant, where exactly you want to place those seeds. And I have a link to that here and in the documents that I have shared with you if you're interested in that. And the next question you want to ask yourself is, what do you want to plant? So some of the good questions to keep in mind is, what produce do you spend the most money on throughout the year? And which vegetables and fruit taste better from the garden? Which vegetables and fruit would you eat more of if you had better access to them? And what vegetables are easy to preserve for out of season eating? So as you select your plants, depending on the mature size of your plant, you'll grow either 1, 4, 9, or 16 equally spaced plants per square foot. So some of the larger plants like peppers, you just put 1 per square foot, and some of the smaller plants like carrots, you can grow 16. So as you are purchasing your seeds, it's very important to read the seed packets of the seeds that you buy. They have really important information on there, such as how quickly it sprouts, what time of year you want to plant them, how deep you should plant the seed, how far apart you should have each plant. So I highly recommend learning all the information from your seed packets so that you can have a successful plant crop. So if the seed packet recommends plant spacing to be 12 inches apart, you will just plant 1 plant per square foot. And if it says 6-inch spacing, you'll put 4 per square feet. If they can be 4 inches apart, you'll put 9 per square feet. And if 3 inches of spacing, you can put 16 per square feet. And some larger plants, mainly tomatoes, take up more than 1 square foot of space, and those take up 4 square feet. So after you've decided what plants you want in your garden, you need to plan out where you're going to put them in your garden. So on the right here, that shows every year I make a new plan, and they can be somewhat similar to the year before, but I'm always changing it around a little, trying to make it better. So we have 12 4x8 raised beds. And so here on the left, for every one of those raised beds, I'll plan out what I want to put in each square foot. And I have a gardening notebook that I take out with me whenever I garden. And when I'm planting, I'll take my notebook out there and I just follow my plan, and I can plant in every square foot according to what I have in my plan. And as you're making this plan, you also want to remember you want to put the taller plants in the back. So the shortest things go in the front and the tallest things in the back. So as you go ahead and you start planting, you can first make the holes depending on how many are in each square feet. And then you can plant 1 or 2 seeds in each spot just by making a shallow hole with your finger or a pencil. And then you want to cover your seeds lightly, but not pack the soil down. And so if more than 1 plant comes up in each hole, you can just take a pair of scissors and you can snip off the extra plant. And you don't want to pull it out because that can disturb the roots from the plant you want to keep. So when you have extra seeds, the best place to store those are cool and dry, which a good place for that is in your refrigerator. And you don't want to overplant. So as you're making your plan and deciding where to plant, you want to only plant as much of any one crop as you will actually use. And the next tip into making your plan and planting is to use succession crop planting. So I have a bunch of space in my garden for lettuce, but I plant throughout the spring season. I plant lettuce every 2 weeks, so that every 2 weeks we'll have more mature lettuce growing out there, so that it's not all ready at once. So as you're making your plan, of where you want to plant your lettuce to keep in mind, and other crops, mostly spring crops are the ones that you do with succession planting. You can plan how often you want to plant your lettuce and space those apart every week or two to have a continuous supply of it throughout its growing season. Now, it's also best not to leave the soil bare around the plants that you have growing in your garden. And I recommend putting a mulch on top of your gardening soil. And adding mulch helps by reducing weeds. The sun cannot get to the weeds, so you will have a lot less weeds growing in your garden. It also helps retain the water better in your garden and keeps the soil at a constant temperature. So in square foot gardens, some of the good mulches you can use are grass clippings, but unfortunately we have like lots of dandelions in our grass. So usually when we want to be using grass clippings to put in our garden, it has a lot of dandelion seeds, which we want to avoid. So we frequently don't use grass clippings unless you don't have that problem. What we found is this marsh hay or this easy straw works really well for us. And you want to make sure you buy something that's weed free. So this one says 99% weed free. That's really important. You don't want to be adding weeds to your garden when you add mulch. You can also use shredded leaves or pine needles. You don't want to use whole leaves because that can actually block the water from getting down. So you want to water only as much as each plant's need, which is about 1 inch per week. But if it's hot and dry, then you'll need to water more often. And especially when you just plant seeds or the seedlings are very young, you'll need to water frequently because you want to keep the soil moist as those seeds are sprouting. But you also want to be careful not to overwater because overwatering in your garden can also be problematic and invite disease. So we don't have this set up, but drip irrigation is the most efficient way to water. So I would recommend that if you have access to that. So as you're harvesting, you can continually harvest from your garden throughout the season, depending on when your crops are ready. And when one crop in one square is finished, you can generally go ahead and add some new compost and plant a new crop in that square right away. So we found square foot gardening great for so many the plants, but there's also some of these bigger crops that don't do as well in square foot gardens just because they're so big and their root balls can be so big that when you pull them out, it can be problematic. You'll take a lot of soil out with you and you can't grow as much in each bed. So we also use a different method of gardening for some of these bigger crops, and it's called lasagna or layer gardening. And you can read more about it in this book by Patricia Lanza. So basically the idea of it is you're adding different layers of organic materials that will decompose over time, resulting in nutrient-rich soil. This is also a method that requires no tilling, which is great because tilling can disturb the soil structure of your soil, which is bad for getting water and air to the roots of your plants. So these are some of the plants. This is an area in our garden. So we have those 12 square foot beds, and then we have this area next to it. And our top layer we always put wood chips on our top layer. And we have built a fence all the way around our garden. There you can see it in the background. It has a wooden frame with a wire mesh on it. So some of the plants that we plant out here in this type of garden is broccoli, cauliflower, kale, squash, melons, and we've even planted tomatoes out here. They do equally well out here or in our square foot gardens. Now, the best time to create the lasagna garden is in the fall, and that's because generally in the fall, there's a lot of organic materials that you have to work with. And then it can sit all winter long and decompose. And also the rain that you get in the fall and the winter snow will help keep your garden moist, which will help it break down quicker. And then it's usually ready to plant in the spring. So if you want to make a garden in the spring, it is possible. It just requires a little bit more effort. You have to, the second to last layer, you need to have 4 inches of compost or topsoil if you want to be able to plant in the bed right away. And then the top layer should be mulch, such as wood chips. So this bed, if you plant in the spring, it will settle over the season as your plants are growing and as the layers underneath decompose. So as you're creating the layers, the bottom layer should be cardboard or at least 4 sheets of newspaper to kill the weeds or grass underneath. And when you're laying down this cardboard or newspaper, you want to make sure you overlap it generously so that there's no cracks in between. And then as you want to alternate layers of brown materials with green materials, and your brown layers should be twice as thick as your green layers. So the brown layers, it's not necessarily the color we're talking about, but what it's made out of. So the brown layers are very rich in carbon, and that includes things like peat moss, shredded leaves, shredded paper, pine needles, and wood chips, which we use for the top layer, but you don't want to use those in any of the bottom layers. And then the green layers are layers that are rich in nitrogen. And that includes compost, composted manure, grass clippings, garden waste, and vegetable scraps. So we have, besides the one next to our square foot beds, we also have this other garden you can see in this picture where we have done this method. And we've put just mounds of wood chips out there. And we now have strawberries, fruit trees, grapes, asparagus, blackberries, all growing out there. And we also use this area to plant like squash and pumpkins and melons. So as you build up these layers, you want to layer until you have a garden bed about 12 to 24 inches high, depending on what you want to plant there. If you're planting big plants, you'll want to have it that 24 inches. If your plants aren't as big, you can only go up to 12 inches or so. But these will shrink over time as it decomposes. And then each year as you're planting more things, you want to add more compost and mulch. And so the compost will continue to give it the nutrients that your garden needs. And then the mulch will help keep the weeds away and help keep the water retained there. So our favorite mulch that we use is wood chips, and you can often get those free from your municipality. And we have that option here, and many other places do as well. So that's a good thing to check. So the last type of gardening I'd like to talk about is just vertical gardening. And one of the benefits of vertical gardening is that it saves space. So you're growing plants up. And so some plants such as peas and pole beans and cucumbers, they need to be supported by a trellis. But other vine crops that can be grown on the ground can also be grown vertically. So if you have less space, this is a good way to try to grow some of those other vine crops. And those can be melons and squash and tomatoes. So the really really big watermelons, you may not be able to use this method, but some of the smaller watermelons, this will work just fine. And the same with some of the squash, like really big pumpkins, this might not work for those, but the smaller pumpkins, it will work. You'd be pretty amazed at how heavy of a crop will hang on a trellis if it's done right. So we now use our fence as the trellis. It has the wooden post with the welded wire fencing attached to it. And you can see in the picture, my husband and two of my boys, and we have beans growing up on the fence. It's completely, it covered that fence pretty much. And then you can see those two, we like to plant these sunflowers in front of the wooden posts, and they get huge. And then you can see the peas here growing in this other picture as well. So the trellises can be purchased or pre-made. So you can just go to the garden center and you can find pre-made trellises, and those are really easy. Or you can construct them yourselves. So before we built the fence around our garden, we actually used a different form of a trellis, and it was a 1/2-inch electrical conduit pipes. And then, so you would pound 18 inches of wire rebar into the ground with leaving a little bit above ground. And then you could put the 1/2-inch electrical conduit pipes right over it. And you would buy the elbows to make it the rectangle shape. And then we would weave a nylon netting weaved onto the pipes for the supports. So that also worked for us in the past. I've also seen trellises made simply from sticks and twine. So whatever works you can use, or whatever you have on hand, just anything that you can use to grow your plants up. Let's see, I think I'll check the chat to see if there's any questions. Okay, how long do seeds last in the fridge? We will get to that in a little bit. And this is a very good question. Doesn't wood chips leach nitrogen from the soil, affecting high nitrogen needing vegetables? So yes, if you were to till wood chips into the ground, that would be problematic, because then it would start leaching the nitrogen from the ground. And that's why I said you would only use those on the top layer of your layer garden. You don't want them under the ground, because those do leach if they are mixed in with your soil. But if you place them on top, they will, you don't have that problem. You only want to put those on top, as they will break down over time. Actually, when we started that big garden that I showed you with the wood chips, our neighbor was very concerned, and he talked to us about the same thing. He was afraid that we were wasting a lot of time and energy, and that it wouldn't work, but it's worked great for us. They decompose over time on the top, so we do add more occasionally, and we haven't had a problem. We're very successful doing that, as long as you make sure they only stay on the top. Okay, so the next thing I'd like to talk about is when to plant. And so this is different. When you want to plant something is different depending on which crop you are planting. So, but there are some general rules of when to plant things. And so the first thing you want to know is your last frost date. And here where I live, it's May 23rd. And if you live in other warmer climates, it might be earlier for you. And so some crops are frost tolerant. That means they can handle some freezing temperatures. So those would be the spring crops. Other crops are not frost tolerant. So if you would plant them out and then you got a freeze, it will kill them. So you want to definitely make sure that you are past the freezing point in your area when you plant these other crops that are not frost tolerant. So there's lots of recommendations that you can find, and you want to follow your seed packets specifically. But most different varieties of seeds follow these same rules. And I've put together this chart for you, which I've also shared with you. And so this top row here is if you want to start seeds indoors. So you can, these are when is the best time for me to start the seeds indoors. And if your average frost date is different, you just want to adjust the dates there. So it would, these first things I actually plant at the end of February, 12 weeks before my average frost date. And then this chart down here, it shows when you plant things outdoors. And so there's generally, you have early spring. So it says pretty much as soon as the soil can be worked, you can start planting these things as soon as your soil thaws. And then some things you can, quite a few things you can plant 4 weeks before your last frost date, a few more 2 weeks before, and then the rest of it you plant on your last frost date. So you can find your last frost date at this website here, plantmaps.com, and by entering in your zip code. And so some things you can plant directly outside by seed, and others you need to transplant. And the reason you will need to transplant other things is because there's just not enough time in the growing season for them to grow and bear fruit during that season. So here's some more of this plan that I've shared with you all. And it shows the vegetable, when it's best to be planted, and the date you would want to plant them inside or outside. Now, where you get your seeds is pretty important, and you can go to your big box store or wherever they sell seeds locally and buy them, but some of those seeds may not have some of the characteristics that you're looking for. So you need to first decide what qualities are important to you in your seeds, such as are they heirloom or organic or non-GMO, or what kind of varieties that the seed companies have. A lot of times it's hard to get special varieties if you just go to your groceries or you go to your local store. So if you're interested in any of these other qualities to your seeds, it's best if you purchase them and order them. Some of my favorite places to order seeds are the Seed Savers Exchange, the Baker Creek Heirloom Seeds, High Mowing Seeds, Johnny's Selected Seeds, and the Territorial Seed Company. And it's always kind of fun to get your catalogs in the winter and start looking through them and seeing what's new or seeing what you want to plant the next year. So here's the seed storage section that I promised you we'd get to. So as you store your seeds, you can put them in any cool, dry place, but the refrigerator is ideal. And here's a link to Johnny's Seed Storage Guide, which tells you on average how long you can store seeds. So it's very dependent on the different types of seeds. And if you store your seeds well, it will show you how long on average they will last. So as I'm ordering seeds for the next year, I'm always looking at the dates of my previous seeds to see if they would be viable or not. If they are viable, I'll keep them. And if they're no longer viable, I'll go ahead and order more. So if you're interested in starting seeds indoors, it can be pretty time consuming, but it can also be really rewarding. And sometimes it's hard to find just what you want if you try to buy transplanted plants or plants that you transplant. So if I start seeds in plastic flats like these, which you can find a lot of places, big box stores, hardware stores, gardening centers, they're all over the place in the spring generally. And you can also buy the seed starting soil in the same places, you want to be careful that you buy soil that's specifically set just for starting seeds. It's it's different than, say, potting soil, so you don't want to use like a potting soil for this. Um, First, you want to sterilize the soil by getting it wet and cooking it in an oven until the soil reaches 180 degrees Fahrenheit, and then allowing it to cool before using. And I've found out the hard way that this step can be pretty important. In the past, I've skipped this step, and then I'll have a lot of plants die because the soil was not sterilized, and they will die off. They'll a lot of times they'll sprout and they'll look nice for a little while, and then it's called dampening, and they'll just start dying, and there's no saving them at that point. And sterilizing your soil is one of the things that you can do to avoid that. So you want to fill each cavity with loose soil and then plant seeds according to the depth stated on the package. You always want to plant a few more plants than you want in your garden. So you can choose the healthiest ones for your garden, and they don't always survive, so it's best to plant a few extras. And you also want to make sure you label them so you know what you've planted where. Once you're done planting the tray, you want to it comes with a clear plastic greenhouse tray, and you want to put that over your tray until your seeds have sprouted, and then keep the tray in a warm place. So once your seeds have sprouted, you can take the clear tray off the top, and then you want to put them under grow lights for about 16 hours a day. I just turn mine on when I wake up and then turn them off when I go to bed. And we have ours on adjustable chains because you want to keep those within several inches of your plants so that they don't get leggy. Some people try to grow plants just by putting them in your window, and it's generally hard to make that work well. There's really just not enough sunlight in a window to do it well. So after their plants have the first true leaves, which means that it's not the first two leaves that sprout, but once they start getting more leaves on the plant, that's their true leaves. You can occasionally add fertilizer specifically for seedlings according to the package directions. And you also want to make your plant stem strong by giving them some resistance. So we actually aim a fan on ours occasionally to simulate wind. And with that, you want to start small so it's not going too fast, and then work your way up to higher speeds. And then some plants, especially tomatoes and peppers, will need to be repotted once before they'll be ready to plant it in the garden. So I just use a butter knife and I pop out one of the cells, including the dirt, the root, and the plants, and I put it in an empty cup, and then I just fill around it with garden soil. And with peppers and tomatoes, you can bury the stem even deeper to promote more roots and bigger, stronger plants. And you can do that as well when you take these plants and put them out in your garden. You can bury most of the plants except for the top, which gives it even more roots, and that'll help your tomatoes grow larger. So one of the last steps is hardening off your seedlings, and that is the transition from them living inside to living outside. And you want to give yourself lots of time to do it and to go slowly. So you want to start off by putting your seedlings outside just in the shade for an hour or two the first day. And you want it to make sure it's close to room temperature, close to the temperatures that they've been living in so far. And then next, you can start by putting them out in the sun for a little while. And then you can gradually work your way up to them staying outside longer and longer and in cooler or warmer temperatures. But you don't want to do anything drastically that will shock them. So we also have this cold frame here that we use. We like to get our plants out in the sun as much as possible because it is better than the grow lights. And on cooler days, it stays warmer in our cold frame, so we're still able to put the plants outside, even though it otherwise would have been too cold for them to be outside. Okay, I think I see one more question in the chat. Says, when the seed package has been opened but lots of seeds left, can they be vacuum sealed and stored? I have never tried that, but that probably would work very well. Okay, here is a definition of organic gardening, and this is the type of gardening that we choose to use here at our house. And this definition is from Rodell's, which is a big name in gardening. And it says, organic gardeners don't use synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, or herbicides on their plants, but gardening organically is much more than what you don't do. When you garden organically, you think of your plants as part of a whole system within nature that starts in the soil, includes the water supply, people, wildlife, and even insects. An organic gardener strives to work in harmony with natural systems and to minimize and continually replenish any resources the garden consumes. So specifically when you're using fertilizers, there's two different kinds. There's organic fertilizers and synthetic fertilizers. And organic fertilizers are made from naturally occurring minerals, deposits, and organic material. So these fertilizers are not water soluble, so that means they're released slowly into your garden. And they can stimulate beneficial organisms, and they also improve your soil structure. Now, the synthetic fertilizers are made by chemically processing raw materials. Now, these are water soluble, which means that they can be taken up by your plants immediately, and it gives them a quick boost, but does little to improve your soil life and fertility long term. And another big problem with synthetic fertilizers is they can leach in the waterways, causing lots of other problems. So composting is pretty important because adding 1 inch of compost to each garden area every year gives your plants all the essential nutrients your plants will need for growth. And usually if you add that much compost to your beds, you usually do not need to purchase any other fertilizers. They become unnecessary. And you can also have your soil tested. There are labs that are run by the state. So if you're concerned about this, you can have your soil tested to make sure that your soil has what it's need, and if they can recommend other amendments if those are necessary. So what is composting exactly? It's recycling organic materials such as leaves, garden debris, paper, food waste, and manure into rich soil-like material. And so compost is used as a soil amendment, which contains a variety of nutrients that plants need for their healthy growth. And it also improves soil structure and water management. So why should you compost? It offers, besides not needing to buy fertilizer, it offers many economic, environmental, and biologic benefits. So over 60% of the items in landfills can actually be composted. So by recycling your organic materials by composting, it returns those nutrients that they contain to the earth, and it saves all that landfill space. And you generally, like I said, won't need to spend money on other soil amendments or fertilizer. So how do you compost? When adding material to a compost pile is kind of similar to that layer gardening we were talking about. You mix 2 parts of brown with 1 part of green, and the more you chop up or shred large pieces, the faster it will compost. And also, if you keep your pile damp, and it says to keep it as damp as a wrung out sponge, that will also speed up the process. And the biggest thing to speeding up the process of composting is to turning your pile occasionally. And so when you turn the pile, basically you take it from one area and you move it to a different area, and it shifts the inside of the pile to the outside. It breaks up the clumps, it mixes up the greens and brown materials, and it significantly speeds up the composting process. Here we have so much compost that we generally don't do that because it just takes too much time and we don't have a lot of that. So we just let it sit, and it will decompose eventually, even if you do not turn the pile. You just have to wait longer to get to it and to use it. So here are some things you can compost. Leaves, grass clippings, weeds, garden debris, small brush, twigs, fruit and vegetable scraps, untreated, unpainted sawdust or wood chips, eggshells, coffee grounds, tea leaves, hay, manure, aquatic weeds, fur, hair, natural fibers, and feathers. And here are some things you do not want to compost: meat, bones, fat, dairy products, ash, thorny branches, logs, those are just too big, diseased plants, sawdust from treated wood, persistent weeds, poison ivy, or weeds with seeds. Those will cause you problems if you try to compost them. So where do you want to compost? So this is my oldest son, and this was his Eagle Scout project, which was building compost bins at UW here in Sheboygan. And so the easiest way to compost is just to throw your materials in a pile, and you don't need to use a compost bin, but there are some advantages to doing so. They're generally, compost bins are generally more attractive, and it uses your vertical space better, and it helps keep you more organized. It's also generally easier to turn a compost from bin to bin instead of trying to do a whole pile. The next thing I'd like to talk about is controlling weeds, and this is a never-ending battle on the farm. So the very first thing is try to prevent them as much as possible. And here we do that by using mulch over our soil and newspaper. Even in our square foot beds, if we're planting tomatoes in there, we'll put newspaper around it with another layer of mulch on the top to keep those weeds from growing. We also use the rubber mats like I showed you. But no matter what you do, you're going to have weeds. And so generally we just go outside once a week and we pull our weeds by hand. And we try to get as much of the root as possible so that they're discouraged from growing back. And here on our farm, we throw our weeds to our chickens. They love to eat them, and they turn them into even more compost for us. But you can also throw them in your compost pile as long as they don't have seeds on them yet. So we do not use chemical weed control here, so I don't know a lot about it. But if you do choose to use chemical weed control, the one major thing that they always talk about in the classes that I take is that you need to follow the label, and that includes the directions. You want to read the whole directions about it and follow exactly how much and how often to use, and also to be sure to use the proper personal protective equipment it recommends so that you stay safe. Now, the next big problem that you can have in a garden is pests. And information about common pests here in Wisconsin can be found at this Wisconsin Pest Bulletin. And the same rules, if you do decide to use chemical pest control, the same rules as the weed control apply. You want to just read the label and follow it exactly. So when you do have a pest problem in your garden, there's things you want to identify before you begin to take any steps. The first one is to know your enemy. So not all garden insects are pests. There are insects that could be in your garden that are actually beneficial to your garden. So you want to do some research to correctly identify the insect first. You want to get to know its habits and life cycles to properly select and time the treatments that you're going to use. The next is to set thresholds. So you want to determine a level of acceptable damage. And here, like I said, we don't use sprays. So yes, we do have, you know, some of the leaves of our plants have holes in them from bugs. Um, but it's only when that gets so bad that you do need to do something about it. So not all pests will cause significant damage and you know, do any significant harm to your plants. So the next, you just want to watch closely. And when your observations indicate that pest levels are high enough to cause too much damage to your plant, that's when you want to consider treating them. And then if treatment is necessary, you want to start with the least harmful control measures and then work your way up if you need to. So there are 6 different organic pest control methods, and the first 2 are cultural controls. It involves manipulation of the environment to favor the beneficial insects and or inhibit pests. So changes you can make in your garden include adjusting the soil pH, adjusting how you're watering your plants, adjusting how much sunlight your plants are getting, and selecting pest-resistant plants in the first place. The next one is mechanical controls. And so these include a wide variety of tools that remove, trap, or exclude garden pests. These methods include copper tape for slugs, yellow sticky traps for fungus gnats, and then there's lots of other traps for specific insects. The one thing I did want to say is you do not want to use Japanese beetle traps on your property, because what they found is even though you will trap a lot of Japanese beetle, even more beetles will be attracted to your property and it will actually cause more damage by having one of those. But most mechanical controls aren't like that, but that one is different. Now the last method, oh, one I forgot to put on here, but you can use row cover cloth to cover your plants to try to exclude any bad insects. And the last one is to just hand pick, and you can go out and just pick the bugs right off the plants. One good way to do this is to put a board down in your garden next to the plant you're having a problem with. And if you go out on a cool morning and you flip the board over, you'll often find a lot of those insects hiding under that board. And you can just take care of them all quickly and easily that way. Those are pretty much the only 2 that we use here on our farm. And we found just by using those methods, we can keep insects mostly under control. We actually have a lot more problems with weeds despite the efforts we take to minimize those as well. And yeah, insects have occasionally killed some of our plants, but overall we find that that we would rather have that in our garden space than spraying things into our garden that we aren't comfortable having and that aren't beneficial for us or the other organisms in our garden. So next up on our list, we have beneficial insects. And these have been used in this country since the late 1880s. And they can be predatory or parasitic insects that attack and only destroy other specific insects. And they're harmless to people, plants, and pets. So that can be another good thing to look into if you're inclined. There's also biological pesticides, and usually these are pest specific, and these are either living organisms, parasites, predators, and pathogens, or the toxins produced by them. Biological pesticides have very little or no effect on beneficial insects and are safe for the environment. So if you can find one of those for the problems you're having, that is another good solution. Now this page, these methods can be a little bit more problematic. The first one is soaps, oils, and abrasives. These controls are broad-based in their actions and include products that dehydrate or smother pest insects. So I can always not say this word right, but I think it's diatomaceous earth insecticidal soap, and horticultural oil. And they are generally considered natural and degrade quickly in the environment. However, they are not selective. So they will kill beneficial insects, so you want to take precaution with them. And the last one is botanical insecticide or an organic insecticide. And some people have the mistaken belief that if it's organic, it means it's perfectly safe. And that's not true. It just means it's derived from natural sources. So some organic products can be harmful to you and the environment. So you do need to do some research when you use these products and read the labels and understand what you're using. So, but these are derived from plants, and these organic pesticides provide a quick knockdown to a large number of garden pests. They are powerful insecticides, but non-selective and will harm beneficial insects. And a major advantage of using these over their chemical counterparts is they do biodegrade more quickly. So I think I'll go to the chat and see if there's any more questions here. Yes, you can put shredded paper in your compost pile. That works just fine. And it says, when you sterilize the soil, if you sterilize more than you end up using, can you use it the next year, or would you need to sterilize it again? Ooh, I would say, just to be on the safe side, you should probably re-sterilize it. Okay. Let's move on.
Also, Abby, there was one, how do you keep your leftover seeds?
Yeah, I do put mine in the refrigerator. I have just like a box of them, and I'll take them out when I head down to my garden, or if I'm doing some of my garden planning, but otherwise I keep them in the refrigerator year round. Luckily, we have an extra fridge, so that helps. We have enough space for that because I do have quite a few seeds. But having 4 boys, having that extra fridge around often seems necessary.
And a couple more questions. There was one from before.
Okay.
Where do you buy your black mat?
Okay, we bought those black mats from Uline. It was many years ago, and I'm not sure. I know some things are harder to find now than they used to be and more expensive than they used to be, but that's where we had bought them. I would say, I don't know, we had them for at least 5 years though, and we have had no problems with them. They've held up very well. We plan for them to hold up for many more years. So.
And then there's another new one. What about storing your seeds in the freezer? And if you have done that, are they dead? Because that's what I had learned, and mine are in the freezer.
Oh yeah, you can store your seeds in the freezer as well. That's fine. I think you generally want to thaw them before you use them. But storing them in the freezer is safe as well. They're not going to be harmed. So, and I actually have done that, like in the winter when I'm not using them at all. That's especially, you can throw them in the freezer, and that'll help them. Well, probably last even longer that way. So if you want to extend your season and, garden past Labor Day and beyond, you can plant some crops for a fall garden. So here's another plan that I have made. And basically most of the plants you'll be planting in your fall garden are similar to the plants that you can plant in your spring, in the early spring. And so here it shows what type of plant and how often. So when we are talking about planting our garden in the spring or early summer, you're talking about your last frost date. So the last date you can expect frost for that season. And then when you're talking about your fall garden, you need to determine what your first frost date is, or on average, when you have your first frost in the fall. And then you plan your garden accordingly to that date. And here mine is October 15th. So many of these plants, so you'll want to adjust your dates according to when your first frost date is. And so this chart just shows you how many weeks before that first frost you want to be planting these. So some of these crops even taste better after a frost, such as kale. It tastes sweeter once it's been frosted. So, but when you plant a fall garden, that usually means you're planting seeds in your garden in the mid to late summer, and it can be especially hot and dry then. So it's especially important to keep those seeds wet then if you want them to germinate. One thing I have learned is to help keep them wet. When you plant your seeds, you can cover them like with a board or something like that, and it helps keep the soil wet underneath them. But as soon as those seeds start sprouting, you want to take that off so they can get the sun and the air and have the space to grow that they need. So that's in general, having a fall garden is actually pretty easy, but this is one of the challenges of it, just making sure that those seeds and seedlings stay watered more often. And then if you want to extend your harvest even further in your fall garden, you can do it also in the spring and in the fall by using low tunnels with either row cover cloth or plastic sheeting over them. And these row tunnels can be just as simple as getting lengths of PVC pipe and bending it in an arc over your garden, and then putting this row cover cloth or plastic sheeting over it. So the row cover cloth, it helps keep it warmer, and it also allows rain to get through. So that is very beneficial. It saves you watering. You can use plastic sheeting as well, and that works even better in trapping the heat, but then you have to be much more careful with making sure your plants have the water that they need. And also on those warmer fall days, making sure your plants don't get too hot in there. You need to keep an eye on that as well. And if you're interested in the row cover cloth, I have a link here for it. You can also use things such as cold frames and greenhouses to extend your harvest. And if you're interested in more information on that, I have 2 books here that we have. And there's also many other books, I'm sure, that have similar information on them you can buy or get from your library if you're more interested in making your harvest go as long as possible. And the last, so we actually grow greens at our house year round. So when we can't grow them outside anymore, then I actually do some indoor gardening. So it is possible to grow food indoors, but a lot of different plants will need grow lights to do that. But one exception is sprouts, which can be grown in a window. And I've learned how to do a method from this book here, year round salad gardening, indoor salad gardening by Peter Burke. And he grows nutrient dense soil sprouted grains in less than 10 days. So I have bought these ledges that you can just suction cup right to any window. You'll actually start the seeds and you keep them in a warm, dark cupboard for the first 4 days, and then you put them out in your window and they start to grow and green up in your window for a few days after that before they are ready to eat. And in this picture, this was from a few years ago, and he recommends these little aluminum trays, I think is what they are. And I've since moved on, and I just found some trays that are shallow and work really well just from Walmart, like the cheapest Tupperware you can buy at Walmart. And that's what I've moved on to using now for this process. But it's great to have nutritious greens all year round. And that's one way to extend your harvest even further. Now, if you are looking for even more information, first of all, I'd like to recommend the Wisconsin Horticulture website, which is hosted by the UW-Madison division of the Extension. So all the information they provide is research-based, so you can rely on it to be accurate. If you just Google things, you never know if the information you're gonna get is accurate or not. So here's a couple links. The first link is to their main website, and the second link is to a place where they have lots of different articles that you can download for free and read. Now, another person that I follow, her name is Cain, and she has she's known as the creative vegetable gardener, and she actually lives in Madison, and she covers a lot of in-depth information about gardening in the area on her blog and website, which I have a link to that site posted here as well. And Melinda Myers, I've watched multiple presentations by her, and she has a lot of great gardening information on her website. And another good website where they have accurate information is Gardening Know-How. So if you want even more resources, those are some really good ones I suggest going to. And I'll head up here to the chat and answer any more questions. Oh, this is a good point. She says 3x3 black mats are often used in horse stalls, so farm supply stores usually have them. And that's true, but I do have to say that the ones we bought were much cheaper. The ones we bought from Uline were a lot cheaper than the ones I have found at farm stores in my area. But you can find them there if you want. And here's another question: how to store the produce you have grown and length of time. Is this another? Yeah, that I just focused on the growing section here, but I do have a lot of experience with storing the produce that we grow. So some vegetables I prefer frozen and not canned, such as corn and green beans and peas and asparagus. So we like to freeze a lot of those vegetables, which usually just requires blanching first and then putting in the freezer. And then some of the things I do can, such as tomatoes, I usually can a lot of tomato products each time. And so if you're interested in canning, I do have some recipes for that if you're interested. So if you have any other questions, I'm open for those at this time.
Feel free also to unmute and ask a question.
Yeah.
Hey, Abbie, I noticed further up in the chat, I don't know if you answered it, somebody asked if you could put shredded paper in your compost pile.
Yeah, shredded paper in your compost pile works just great.
Any other questions?
This is Sharon. I was just thinking out loud how this is a great business venture if someone wants to go from house to house and help start their garden.
Yeah.
There's so much information of like, oh, where do I start? Does someone want to just come and just start it for me and I can just go from there?
I know there are people that will do that. So if you're interested, you might be able to find someone like that who would help you do that.
I think your boys are probably very well trained that they could be hired.
Yeah.
Well, any further questions? Well, we have our expert here. As Shelley says, great presentation. Thank you. Absolutely.
Well, thank you.
That. Abbie,
I have a question, Abbie, which you think I would have asked you all the times I see you, but I didn't remember. I see the sunflower seeds. Do you harvest the kernels in there for your salads and so on?
Yeah, we do eat them ourselves sometimes, but actually a lot of those sunflowers that we use, we feed to our chickens. They're a really good source for the chickens that we have.
Oh, okay.
So,
And Rick, I see you had a hand up.
I was clapping.
Heidi, could I ask
That's
something?
our daughter.
Yeah, thanks, Dad.
I wanted to ask questions about gardening at 5,000 feet in northern Utah behind the mountain.
Yeah, it's a little
But we'll
different
ask
there.
her later when she comes to visit.
Yeah.
I do want to say that it's just really fun to begin a garden, and when you first begin, you may not be able to do all the things that Abbie has taught to us about. So you just start where you are now, and you learn and grow every year as you plant your garden, and you just keep trying. And
That's
you'll-
exactly what we've done here. Every year we learn something new, we do things different, we add more.
And you have to grow zucchini because zucchini usually always grows, and it always
Yeah.
Heidi and Abbie, could I ask something?
Sure.
I was wondering what your favorite tomato varieties are to grow.
So I mostly grow paste tomatoes, and I like the Romas. And let me look real quick.
While she's looking at that, just a reminder, if you would like her handouts, and I did not get them to you at 4 o'clock this afternoon, that means I do not have your email. Please put your email in the chat, and I can get those attachments to you, as well as for any future classes. I will be emailing you out the list for the next class. So a reminder for next Sunday, May 22nd, is the ward branch emergency response for those. So tell your church leaders, your unit leaders to join us. Part 1 is already on our YouTube channel. And again, if you want to be on our YouTube channel, we have 5 other classes that we already have up there. Some of those are short and long-term food storage, what to store, water storage and purification, light, heat, fuel, emergency kits, vital documents, and then creating your individual and family response plan. So those videos are already on our YouTube channel, and I can send those out to you. And then the last class after that one, I already announced at the beginning, but for those who weren't on, I am meeting with Jody Weiss Schrader, who is a phenomenal person with cooking with food storage. And so I will send that information out in the future. But back to you, Abbie, on tomatoes.
Great. So another variety I really like is called Amish paste. And those are even bigger than Roma. So that's nice when you're picking them and processing them. One called Salvatierra Select is also a really good paste tomato. I've tried Alpaca, Federally, and I'm trying a few new ones this year as well. One called Heirloom Marriage Marzanera and Oregon Star, which have, I guess, our favorites. So those are the ones I recommend.
All right, any other?
Thanks very much.
This is Ruth Brill, and I also have a question. Sorry, I put my video on. The biggest deterrent that I have to gardening is verticillium wilt, which is a fungus found in the soil. And basically I can grow any leafy things, but I can't grow any fruiting things. They just fail, including tomatoes. It's astonishing. It's terrible. Anyway, it's in the soil. And so a person can have clean, sterilized soil 1 year, but then all the spores are going to be in the soil in your garden beds. And so what do you do to re-sterilize your soil in the garden beds? You know, do you just have to dig them out every year and redo everything? What, you know, I mean, it seems...
We have never experienced that type of problem here. And that's a question that I think I would refer to your extension agent to see what they recommend. They would probably have the best answer for that. I'm not sure.
You can pretty much tell if you have it or not. Just look at the Colorado blue spruces around your neighborhood. And if they look nice and full, you probably don't have it. And if they look all spindly, you probably have it. So, okay.
That sounds tough. Well, good luck.
Any other questions?
I have a question. Any suggestions for starting or how to start a compost pile or bin? Like what to do just to start from the very beginning?
Yeah, well, decide whether you want a bin or just find an area in your yard where you want to get it started. And then whenever you have any vegetable scraps from the garden, any of those weeds that don't have seeds, anything like that, you just start heaping it there. Grass clippings. And I think that's how I'd get started. I know they recommend you have those brown versus green layers and have that all figured out. And that is the best way to do it. But if you just start throwing what you have down, it's going to work. It's going to be fine.
I have a follow-up to that question. So I'm just always worried about rodents and all those different things when I think of compost. So I guess that's one of my fear in terms of how to get this. And if you use a bin, how do you rotate that? You know, how does that work?
Yeah, so like the bins that you saw my son in front of, you would just take the compost from one side to the other. And if you're worried about rodents and you definitely don't want those on your property, you could maybe even enclose your bins with using wire or something like that to keep them enclosed. You can also buy like bins. There's lots of options online if you want to spend some money on it, if it's important to you. And we used to have this like big black tumbler type of thing where you throw all your compost things in, and you can even spin it up so it helps mix it up. And that might be a good option for you.
So we have, I take one of my 4x4 beds and put a fence around it because I always have everything fenced anyway, and we just dump stuff in, and every few years we start a new one and plant something in that one. It works. I mean, it can't not work.
Yeah, eventually it decomposes and eventually it gets nice. Mm-hmm.
Abbie,
Yes.
so I started doing some of the composting. So I have this little, in the winter time, this ice cream bucket underneath my sink. And I throw in the scraps and stuff like that. And I was concerned that it was going to start to mold and stink and be disgusting. Luckily, it didn't. I don't know why it didn't. But I would put my eggshells in there and then just crunch them up with a potato masher. Do we have to crunch up the eggshells, or should you leave them whole? Does it matter?
Well, we don't, but at the same time, if you want your compost to go faster, you should crunch them up. So it depends on what's important to you. If you want to save time and effort, don't crunch them up. If you want your compost to be ready faster, then you should crunch them up. Whatever is most important to you.
Hey, Abbie, do you have to wash your eggshells?
No, we don't.
Okay.
I guess to Lona Burke, so you don't get any little bugs underneath underneath your cupboards.
I haven't. Like I said, I was really nervous that it was going to be disgusting. But I would just throw in my table scraps, when you're cutting off the celery and the ends of the carrots and all that good stuff. And then every time I put something new in there, I would just take that potato masher and just kind of turn it around to get air in there. And maybe I didn't do it long enough or something, but I don't know. It didn't get gross. I don't know why it didn't get gross, because I just figured, well, once it did, then I would just throw it outside on the bin. But something to think about.
There's also like countertop compost things that you can buy that are specifically designed for that. So you can look into that as well. Also, we actually give a lot of our scraps to the chickens who then make compost in a different way. So that's what we do, but you could also keep a bucket like that in your fridge or even in your garage in the winter. So it's not going to start rotting and smell bad and attract bugs.
All right, one last call. Okay, well, Abbie, thank you so much. Barnes, you raised a fabulous daughter. And thank you for joining us. But Abbie, thank you so much for all the time and effort you put into this presentation. I'm sure it was hours and hours, and we really, really appreciate it. And for those of you, once again, this recording will be on our YouTube channel. I'll have it up the next couple days. The 7 attachments that you all received, and I did get 4 of you 4 more emails that I will send out. One of them had all the links that she shared in her presentation, which was fabulous, as well as planning a garden and the scheduling of the planning and phenomenal information. Those 2 will also be under the YouTube video. They'll be posted there as well. So you should all have easy access to go back and see it all. But thank you all for joining us, and I will get you out more information when we get the cooking with food storage one ready. And again, spread the word about ward unit emergency plan class for part 2 next week. So same time, same bat channel. You guys have a marvelous Sunday evening, and thanks for joining us.